I'm Layman Pascal, and as you know, different states or different ontological domains are of deep interest to integrative metamodern and New Thought communities. You might also know that the variations and paradoxical elusiveness of non-duality in particular is one of my central philosophical and experiential concerns. I'm very interested, deeply interested in how we distinguish non-duality from unitive mysticism, how we situate it relative to body, ecology, history, and growth, how we language it or do not language it, and how we might be able to say it differently and enact it differently. And one of the most important resources for that kind of exploration are contemporary independent non-dual realizers who operate largely outside of traditional frameworks and who are living out their own journey in terms of how they conceive, articulate, and enact their transformation and the layer of reality to which those transformations are pointing. So, on that basis, I am very happy to spend some time today with contemporary non dual realizer and teacher, Leeza Edwards. Hi, Leeza.
Hi, Layman.
Why don't we start with your quote unquote personal journey? Did you have any insights, altered states, inclinations of higher awareness as a child? Or was it pretty kind of conventional childhood?
I think upon reflection, I've noticed a disconnect from the common sense of what we would call reality, but it never lingered. I would say I had a pretty conventional upbringing, had a lot of questions as a child, I would say. I grew up in the Southern Baptist Church, and so I asked a lot of questions that questioned timelines and the history of the world, and I was essentially asked not to come back to Sunday school anymore. I do recall being very inquisitive, but most of my childhood was feeling quite small and insignificant. And in that sense of feeling that I, the separate me, are so insignificant, I played small, therefore I felt small and I perceived small. And so I lived in a quietude. I was very much alone because my siblings, I'm the baby of five children, but there's a large gap between the closest one in age to me, which is 6 years my senior, and myself. So I kind of grew up as an only child in a way. So I would say probably in a standard American experience, it was pretty conventional.
How did you end up in the military? And what did you get from that? What was useful about that experience?
I got a lot of being in the Air Force, mostly adopting a very disciplined attitude, if we could put it that way. I graduated high school and immediately went into basic training. And so I had quickly absorbed a lot of that structure and that rigor. I was deathly afraid when I first joined going into basic training because all of your sort of autonomy and rights are sort of stripped away from you. And they build you up in an image that they want you to be in. And like most people, I acquiesced to that. And I got very accustomed to having things regimentedly laid out for me. And it was difficult for me to get out of the military and back into civilian life, actually. So after that period of acclimation, it was great getting in, but that period of acclimation of getting out, that took some doing.
It seems to me like um, there's many practical things about the military, but one of the interesting features is it's a bit like a secular monastery in a way.
I could see that. Very much so.
So you
Yeah,
come out
very
and
tight quarters.
there's a difficult personal and cultural readjustment to how you live outside of that very controlled environment. How do you go through that adjustment, and how do you get from there to a personal awakening experience?
A lot of tumultuousness, a lot of upheaval. I it took a couple of years for me to sort of find some footing as a civilian. And it took a friend from high school to reconnect and encourage me to take on a particular job in retail management. And so that provided me again that stability. And when it came to relationships, it was always, as it has always been, very brief and very rare. And so I had adopted a sense of a monastic way of life, not really putting a lot of interest in relationships, like intimate relationships. So therefore, I had a lot of time to think by myself. And so I always find it interesting when I talk to people who have spent rarely any time throughout their life alone. And that always has fascinated me. But how would you know yourself if you're always with someone else in an intimate way, where it can't be just your decision, it has to be a decision with others, right? To consider what my partner would say or what they need. And that journey took on many forms until about 17 years ago, or about this time of year in '07. I think that was 17 years ago, where I had started living in San Francisco, had gotten rid of most of my possessions. And so I lived a very simple life, working as a barista, and started a spiritual seeking journey or process of seeking. And that put me in, living in San Francisco was a good place for that, because I would meet all sorts of people wearing headdresses and collars and saffron robes, and ask very curious questions about, of all the possible options of ways that we can express ourselves, how did you find yourself there? And so over a period of maybe 6 months or less, I became the inquisitor of everything, even my own thoughts. And I took that to a degree where I didn't question reality, because I literally questioned every thought that arose, driving myself mad. And I got to a breaking point in one evening, having an existential crisis, looking in the mirror and not feeling a great sense of dissatisfaction. And it was that process of asking questions in the mirror where I say this with a little tongue in cheek, I broke. The me that I had believed and known myself to be had to dissolve in some way. And so that began a whole new journey of how do I now live now that the illusion is now seen so clearly. And so it's been a wonderful period of peace and clear knowing, if we can put it that way.
Your uh, tongue-in-cheek description of the self breaking is humorous because it could go in either direction. Could be a breakdown or a breakthrough. What indications did you have that this was a positive development? Did you have such indications? Were you concerned at all that you might be going crazy or having a psychotic episode or something like that? Or did it seem very trustworthy to you?
It was very trustworthy. The first recognition was waking up the next morning after my crisis, and that buzzing, and it's not a literal thing, but the voices, as Eckhart Tolle might say, the voices in the head had completely dissolved. I literally sat up in bed and just took stock of what was present. And what was clear was of the, how old was I? 40 years of age. I think that's how old I was. 40 years of busyness of mind was no longer present. And so I noticed what was absent. And then these joyful tears would start to come up. But there was a lightness to the physical body as well. I felt as if I felt lighter. It was a sense of ease about how I felt physically and emotionally and mentally. I didn't feel this need or compulsion to get up or to do anything. And as each of these recognitions would keep arising, the tears of joy kept deepening and the laughter would start to come out. But it was a deep laughter, a laughter I had never experienced before. And so there was a free flowing of emotions that would arise, whereas before I would keep my emotions in check. And so I noticed the absence of the need to control anything. And that recognition of this and this and this kept evolving and evolving. And even though the thoughts that were conditioned to be a particular quality of thought might still arise, they were met with inquiry. They were met with recognition and no longer clinging or identifying with the thought that may arise. So there were many things that illustrated the trustworthiness of this new experience.
You mentioned Eckhart Tolle. When did you encounter his work and what did it mean to you?
I heard about Eckhart soon after the book A New Earth was released. And that was, I think, a year prior to having clarity, maybe less, I don't recall. I was working for a temp agency, working for a large financial firm in downtown San Francisco, and I bought an iPod, and I found a way to get the CDs of the audiobook onto my iPod and listened to that audiobook repeatedly, day after day. So on the way to and from work, at home while eating, in any opportunity, I would listen to his voice, and it was very soothing. And it was very, he was revealing things that was already known. And I didn't have a real framework linguistically outside of the occasion of hearing maybe a recording of Ram Dass or Alan Watts. But I just knew that there was truth here. And that went on for quite some time. I think it was a month or more that I would listen to that audiobook repeatedly. And that was the beginning of the deep inquiry process.
When did you, if you did, start to notice that you were having an effect on other people, or that they were noticing or coming to you in a slightly different way?
That was immediate. And that was very, it was playful. It was bizarre. I would be, as I finished the work with the temp agency, I started working for Starbucks when this shift had happened. And I would go to work being this automaticity of the body mind that knows how to dress and go to work on a bicycle and do what it does. And right away, people were coming in to get their lattes or their cappuccinos, and they would start telling me their story. And they were not prompted to do so in any way. And I recognized where this was coming from, and yet again did not have the framework for what is the most helpful way to engage. Because in a cafe, when you're at work, that's probably not the ideal space to do so. So that also started revealing itself right away in my friends. And oftentimes, one by one, friends would no longer come around or call me because I no longer had the investment in their drama or my drama. And so when you divest yourself of that energy of drama, attention seeking, if someone is still living in it, then they don't want to be around you. And so I had less friends, we'll put it that way.
It's interesting because it seems like there's some people drawn to this and some people repelled, or if not repelled, sort of indifferent to it. Did you find that the people tuning into what was going on with you were more or less a random sample of the population, or did they have something in common? Did you notice common themes and threads in those people?
Random, yes. The commonality is they were all seekers of some degree and some degree of recognition of where they are, and that the truth is always known, but it has been put aside. And so as deep exchanges start to happen, they recognize, oh, I'm remembering the truth now of what I had set aside. And so then there's that longing that deepens. It's like, I need more of this. And it would be someone who identified themselves as being homeless, living on Market Street. And I would pass them and they would ask for money. And if I had it, I would give it to them. And I would find myself just sitting down with them, something I'd never would have conceived of doing before, and asking who they are. Who are you? And right away, I would see that glimmer of love that would arise in them. It's like somebody is asking me who I am. Somebody sees that I am not this collection of dirty clothes and sitting in my feces and that sort of thing. That the being that is present is prior to all of that. And we would have amazing conversations, true dialogues. There was more than one occasion of going to either Golden Gate Park or sitting at a park that was pretty close to where I was living, called Patricia's Green in the Hayes Valley neighborhood. And I would sit there on a concrete bench and just close my eyes and just be present. And after a period of time, however much time had passed, I would open my eyes and would find 2 to maybe 10, 12 people sitting on the ground in front of me. And I would just be with all of them. And that would be sort of the first steps of having something to say. But it was mostly just being present with others. And so I found that fascinating, that not putting in an advertisement that we're going to have a meditation, people would just show up. And oftentimes these were people who, again, identified as homeless, people that were just coming out from the cafes. They're like, oh, something's happening here, I guess, and I'm going to sit down too. And I would meet with business leaders, CEOs, people in religious circles like Catholic ministers, Buddhist priests from the Zen Center in San Francisco, and have amazing connections with them. And so it ran the gamut as far as connections. I had more people to engage with because more people kept showing up, because the investment was talking about the truth of experience and not what's wrong with the world. So the people that were invested in what's wrong with the world, they no longer showed up anymore, or at least rarely. And that it's just been an effortless sort of unfolding, we could say.
You mentioned that you were drawing on a few resources like Eckhart and Ram Dass and Alan Watts to help um, provoke or frame your journey, but largely you're operating outside of any established spiritual or religious tradition. And I think there's two ways to consider independent consciousness mutants. One is that they're at a disadvantage because they lack the support and the wise maturational help that comes from peers and traditions. The other is that they are in a very good position because they're free from the shackles of tradition and are able to explore what's happening in a fresh and unbiased way. Uh, which of those do you resonate with the most?
The latter, for sure. Um, I was invited to give a talk at the University of Victoria on Vancouver Island. And I did this pretty lengthy talk. And one of the things that came up from one of the attendees was, "You're a non-dual teacher." And that was the first occasion where someone had identified me as such. And I had to sit with that for a while and ask, is that true? Is there such a thing as a non-dual teacher that did not come from a lineage of non-dual teachers? And so it wasn't until years later where I would sort of self-identify to use that moniker in a very unserious way. And the few times that I did so prior to just allowing myself to embrace it, I would always be asked the question, who was your teacher? Meaning, who was your non-dual teacher? And I guess in a way you could say that I had a teacher in listening to Alan Watts and Ram Dass, even though I'm not sure that Eckhart would refer to himself as a non-dual teacher, because he had apparently a similar experience where he did not come from that lineage, and yet here's the experience that is unhinged from tradition. So yeah, but it was also the 8-year-old.
I often think about it like mycelium and mushrooms. These vast mycelial networks under the ground, and sometimes you see a little cluster of mushrooms and it looks like they're in a row. But some other mushroom springs up way down in the forest some other time. It really is connected somehow, but there isn't an obvious immediate lineage or succession going on.
Good analogy. I love that.
I will add also that I attended the University of Victoria and lived in Victoria for many years.
Oh, interesting. The world is not so big after all.
There's a great, I don't know if you know the stand-up comedian Stephen Wright, but he always had this joke that it's a small world, but I wouldn't want to paint it. um, so without being too serious about the words and labels, is fun or appropriate about non-duality compared to oneness or emptiness or other ways to try to language things? What is it about saying not two that gives it an advantage over saying one or none?
The advantage is the realization of freedom. As soon as we recognize I no longer have to prop up this separate, special self, that's freedom. As long as I'm identified with the separate, special I, that is suffering. That is exhausting. And so I would say the advantage is the lived experience of freedom, a sense of liberation that I no longer have to continually prop up this sense of importance and a sense of duty and obligation. There's a freedom that I can live from a place of I'm always on time, a freedom of I'm doing what I can, and that doing comes from a deeper knowing as opposed to an intellectual, I have to do this because I need to be perceived in a certain way. So that freedom that arises, or that sense of liberation, is the advantage, I would say.
It's notoriously hard to language the unspeakable, and yet paradoxically, we can and must evolve ways to communicate, even though those will always be incomplete. And to some degree, that's a co-creative endeavor that people being with us and asking us things pull out phrasings in various ways. So I imagine something like that happened to you. But I wonder where you are now in the journey of languaging this kind of experience or non-experience or whatever we want to call it. What's your journey been with trying to speak these things?
I think over the past, we'll say 10 years, I have cultivated a sense of using certain analogies and metaphor, cultivating that linguistic framework to help maintain a sense of grounding in conversing with others and actually having a dialogue. Recognizing that if someone's arguing for their sense of suffering, they're arguing for their sense of, I am the separate self, that there are ways to reflect back to them, to inquire into that, are you really, and where does that come from? Before we get into getting into you are awareness itself, maybe we need to tend to this agitation that has arisen. And that takes time, and it requires patience and persistence. And I've met people who are in the throes of profound existential crisis, a profound sense of separation, making themselves to elevate themselves, to feel bigger. And I might meet that with, why do you feel this compulsion? Or better asked, then we reframe the language, where's this compulsion coming from? So it's the reframing from why to where's it coming from? Or what is driving this energy, this compulsive attitude towards trying to be right, or to be first, or to be heard, or to feel special? And I'm as surprised with one's capacity to go from that profound sense of agitation immediately into a sense of openness and receptivity. As much as I'm surprised that I would engage with another in that, again, that heightened sense of agitation and that specialness, that we would have sessions for months before there would be a dissolving of that solid separation. So I found them equally surprising. And yet it speaks to the readiness, the openness of the apparent separate one to come not just into the understanding of the self, but to embody that self, to embrace all of the feelings, the emotions, the thoughts, the perceptions, without resistance, to ultimately fall in love with life. And so there's, in some sense, a constant refinement of language, but I've pretty much have cultivated over the past 10 years, um, really refining that linguistic approach, depending on where someone is in the moment or where it feels that they are.
There are some developmental philosophies that place a lot of emphasis on the distinction between states and stages. And this notion that there are ways of being that we can tune into at any moment of our life, and that we might exist in them for some unknown period of time and then fall back out of them. And by going in and out, we might build up something in ourselves, but essentially it's a type of reality that we always have access to. But on the other hand, there's a developmental maturational model, which says that by reflecting upon ourselves and examining the intricacies of our being, we constantly grow and reiterate new layers and gain a kind of meta awareness or contextual, context aware, construct aware self knowledge that catches our thoughts and perceptions as they arise. I'm curious how you view that kind of weird relationship between it's always available to us and we need to grow and develop and learn in order to discover it. Are these the same thing? Are they different things? How do you see them interacting? The growth to complexity in this, but also the simplicity of perpetual availability.
They're both true simultaneously. And so the truth of experience, that love is ultimately the only thing that is, or in a different context, awareness is the only thing or non-thing that is. But to engage in it with another or with a self, if it is not felt and deeply known, if it's not become imbued in the body mind, then it becomes a conversation about these nuances that you're referring to. The nuance of, well, today I might listen to a recording from Ram Dass because I intuit that that's what I'm ready for. And then I do this from day to day to day. And I'm like, I think I'm ready for Deepak Chopra. Maybe I'm ready for Eckhart. And so it's that self-reflection, that intuition that can guide us to, oh, I'm not ready for non-dual speak, as it were. So maybe I need to talk about metaphysics for a bit, or talk about crystals or something like that, as an opening door to the next and the next. And so that's more of a self-reflection aspect of what am I really open to in this moment? When you're engaged with another, like if someone were to come to a talk, a gathering, say there's 15 people, 5 of them are ready to just surrender. They're just ready. And 5 are very confused about the whole linguistic framework of non-duality because it's so foreign to what they've known intellectually. Then you have another 5 that have been on the spiritual journey for maybe decades, and they're kind of open, but they've not fully prepared themselves for being open to a dialogue that is so foreign. But they're curious enough, there's an openness enough. It's so being able to speak with one voice to three different so-called groups of readiness. One lives in trust. One lives in surrender. And then we'll refine that language as inquiry comes up from each of these three states. And to even call them states is really not a helpful word, because states is a state of mind, as opposed to a readiness, which is no mind. But to be able to refine the language, to add on, to be more, to elaborate more, to come up with more metaphor or analogy, or asking questions for them, of them about their experience, and then find a more appropriate analogy for them, having now heard more about their story. And that could be that instant where, oh, those analogies didn't help you, but this one analogy that you really aligned with, that was the opening gambit. It's like, huh. So they're both held equally. It's like, is there simplicity and complexity? Yes. The truth of experience is that life is simple. On an experiential level, people experience life as complex. And the one that perceives life as complex, well, no one can take that complexity away from them. There has to be a readiness to see life simply. So I guess in that sense, we can't use the analogy of, are you going to take the red pill or the blue pill? Because it's kind of like saying you're either open and receptive or you're in resistance. But constantly asking oneself that question could be sufficient. Because that's true self-inquiry. Though I'm not sure I've adequately responded to that question.
You've nicely responded to that question. I think an adequate response would require volumes of philosophy that couldn't be written for centuries to come. uh, there's, how do I put this? We live in an age where a lot of people feel like sort of civic identity has been dissolved or is at risk. It's also a time of accumulating global crises and an age in which we are constantly solicited by corporations and algorithms that claim to be providing the news. And as a result, in the last generation or two, many people have turned to political and social activism as their primary way of being in the world and of trying to do good and be more than themselves. Do you think there can be non-dual social activism, or does non-dual awareness inherently undermine those tendencies?
I see that there is room for non-dual activism, most certainly. I see that non-dual activism would be activism that is it is sustained from a deeper sense of loving awareness. And in doing so, the activist wouldn't experience a burnout that a lot of activists do. They are sustained from a deeper awareness, a deeper knowing that is beyond the mind's capacity to know, because the mind can only know itself. It cannot know more than itself. But here I'm using the word mind and a conventional sense of the local mind or a localized sense of mind. But the true self, the I am that I am, is prior to that mind. And operating from that, still with the filter of the five senses, but not being identified with the five senses, one could sustain a very long career as an activist without the sense of feeling dread or self-doubt or feeling that their actions as an activist is inadequate. And I've talked to a lot of activists, and almost without fail, they all express a sense of being burned out, that there's not enough activists, there's not enough social justice happening. In other words, they're operating from a sense of insufficiency, that there's not enough to go around. But coming from a deeper place of knowing that there is more than enough. I am sustained in my actions as an activist. But that social activist would not, as we expressed earlier, take themselves so seriously as to say or think or believe that I'm the only one that can resolve the ills of the world, sort of thinking. They just live in a deep knowing. And so they show up for the perfect action for them in that moment. They express words that their mind could not, their conditioned mind could not have comprehended. They will show up from a place of trust. And I say that I see trust as an inside job. It's not trust in a thing or a person or a circumstance. I just live in trust. And if I'm talking to 20 people about a civil action and they're not understanding where I'm coming from, to me, that's not a problem to resolve. I move on regardless. So I don't get frustrated in my activism, in my social justice campaign. I can still feel free to create the websites, do the social media campaigns from a deep sense of loving awareness. So there is room for that.
In Taoism, there's a notion that the Tao is, on the one hand, unutterable and unthinkable, but on the other hand, that it's best expressed as the interplay between yin and yang, between fundamental complementarities. And I'm curious whether you feel like there is a more masculine and a more feminine way of expressing non-duality. Do you feel like those modalities might apply, or do you see them as essentially irrelevant?
On the surface, they're relevant. Beyond the surface, completely irrelevant. So there could be, let me reframe, there is value in all experience. There's value in every thought, every emotion. There's great value. To live from the knowing that I am not a gender, for example, frees me up to take on any gender role or social role or identity because I'm no longer bound by it. So there is room and a validity to having these apparent special qualities that may be shared by many others, or maybe few. And the greater gift, I feel, is to embody them from the place of knowing that I am not those things. Does that make sense at all?
The Canadian media philosopher Marshall McLuhan very famously said that the medium is the message, that the communication tools we use shape our brains, which then shape our cultures and our expectations. Do you think that the immersive world of our digital tools and information networks and the kind of technological civilization we're entering more deeply into today changes the way we think about non-duality, changes the way we need to language it and approach it? Or do you think it's basically the same as it always was?
It appears to be, how else to put that? For as long as I am subject to the medium, be it social media or the newspaper, then I will find it difficult to function in a world of complexity in seeing that this new digital age, as it were, as it has been expressed, is more difficult than previous generations. And there's room for that. There's a context for that, for sure. And there's also a context that says that it's still the operating complexity within. And be it Facebook or the newspaper or the radio programming is insignificant. Having said that, on the surface of things, on the felt sense of I am my body and mind, the medium does matter. And the sense of social media, if I am very much invested in social media, I can easily be overwhelmed. But that's different than being invested in the news in a newspaper that comes once a day or once a week. Then I'm sort of slowly digesting, but I'm taking in very commonly a very biased viewpoint of the journalist or the writer of the blog. So am I consuming that information, that energy, from a sense of being a separate, finite self, then I will find it difficult and complain that no one knows the truth because everyone's saying these different things about what's real. As I know myself, I'm free to still take in that information regardless of the medium. And I'm not overwhelmed by it. I know because I have all of this space to operate from, this infinite space to garner a new point of view on the same subject matter and say, oh, this seems more sound than this bit of information over here. So then I start to say, well, I'll start listening to this more because this over here seems quite biased or that it's coming from a place of opinion instead of facts. And so I can take any medium and see it as difficult and a problem and a societal ill, or I can see it for what it really is, which is I don't go to Facebook for my news because I don't have the confidence that I'm going to find it there. Therefore, I don't invest in that method or that medium. Therefore, I don't see it as a problem that it exists as a medium. I'm not invested in it. Having said that, there are many who do take all of that very seriously. And then to show them that there's another way to consume information without being identified with that information or the medium in which it was delivered. It's all about the one that is aware of it and not the thing that you're aware of. And therein lies again the freedom to listen and watch and read to all of it. But the deeper I go into self, into the awareness of self, into love itself, I find that I've become very select in where I get my information. So was your question pointing more towards that the medium could be the beauty or the ill?
I enjoy the answer that comes from the place of how to be more, how to grow more discriminating and effective in using media by acting from a deeper place, deeper than the conventional self. I'm also very interested in um, how the language, how the forms of the expression of the non-dual fit into particular cultures and particular moments of history. Right? I can look back and it seems like it may have been very useful for some people to have had this notion of the transcendent as a divine God king. It seemed like people were very enthusiastic about that for a while, as if that God king was also the author of the great book of the world. But if we're moving on from books to decentralized information networks, does the metaphor change? Does the mode of communication change? Does the cultural mood that supports realization change? We can't know that, but I think it's a very engaging kind of inquiry.
Yeah, most certainly, yeah. And that's what you're pointing out, Layman, is the very thing that is often thrown out the window, which is context. So often I hear from people, when I hear the way that they talk, it is as if context is completely non-existent. And so they have difficulty communicating how they perceive, how they think, and how they feel. And of course, there's a multitude of reasons why that is. Because what drives them at 5:05 p.m. is different than 5:07 p.m. or the next day. And they could find a sense of sort of a calmness, but as soon as they hear their alarm clock go off, it's I heard Ram Dass say once, it's like the drugs wore off. I'm back into jail again. I'm back into separation. And all it takes is someone to use a particular word, and then we feel lost again. So yeah, context is relevant. I think it's imperative that it's re-emphasized again and again to help people cultivate a sense of communicating, verbally or not. Where am I really? How do I perceive actually? And be with each other in that journey of discovery.
One way to think about the communication that you bring into the world, which is a kind of a traditional way to talk about uh, non-dual teachers, if that's an applicable term, is that they communicate a way for individuals to explore themselves, and also some other kind of more direct feeling transmission or energetic transmission, so that you are communicating and cultivating in people, encouraging a process of inquiry, particularly around their existential condition and the motivating energy of their separateness. But you're also meeting people with love and recognition and just the presence of your being. And some people, I'm assuming, are more inclined to one of those than the other. I wonder if you think everyone needs both or different ways for different people, and if you see different outcomes for people who are more tuned into the feeling recognition and transmission, and those who are more tuned into applying the inquiry process within themselves.
Hmm. That's a fascinating way of framing the question. I feel that it depends on the moments, on the experience, and not the person. Um, the feeling understanding is the most impactful, direct way of self-recognition. And I know that sounds odd to put those two words together. The feeling, understanding. To take something that was known intellectually and bring that into the body mind in a far more embodied way, a more visceral way. And yet there's room for saying that self-inquiry is the most direct path, or the most direct process, we could say. Knowing that these words are insufficient. Because I can use the word path, and I do use it quite regularly. And if this dialogue that you and I are having were part of an ongoing dialogue, at some point I would come and say, there is no path. We could call it the pathless path, but there is no path, because that would imply that there's a distance between myself and myself, or myself and that which is being experienced. But in the realization, there's not even this, it's more this. And we can't even call it unified. So self-inquiry is what I encourage until it is no longer essential. But for the vast majority of us, and for the vast majority of our experience, it is essential. Until I know myself so fully that I would never forget it, it's essential. And at the same time, and this is often brought up in like law of manifestation, a law of attraction sort of language. You have to feel your way into your own manifestation. Or as Dr. Joe Dispenza would put it, you can pray all day. It's all up here in the head. But until you allow emotions, the feeling that you are already abundant to be alive in the body, that prayer, that affirmation will never get past the brainstem. In a non-dual language, we're saying the same thing, that the body and mind feel to be separate. That I want abundance, I want peace everlasting, yet I feel separate, isolated, and a quaking mess. I can't feel both of them at the same time. I have to be in knowing or in believing. But that doesn't mean that there's a problem with having a belief. I had someone tell me once at a talk, I believe what you're saying. They said this to me. I said, don't believe what I'm saying. Because if you're telling me that you're believing what I'm saying, then you're not listening. I'm inviting you into your own knowing of your own experience. Don't make this about me. This is about you. Don't believe anything. But then I said, let's refine the language. Instead of saying don't believe, be open to the self that is absent of a belief. And that is the knowing of yourself. It's the absence of separation, which is the end of all beliefs.
Is at the same time a kind of um, prior completeness, a seamlessness, not even unifiedness, that makes a joke of all process and technique, and a need for us to get better at that, which has the form of process and technique to some degree. And if someone was watching this and listening to this, and if they were tuning in either to a sense of transmission or recognition with whatever you appear to be, and or their own seamlessness, what would be good orienting instructions for them as an organism, as a body mind, to be deeper participants? You were talking about opening the emotions and opening the feeling understanding in order to embody this and take it more viscerally. If someone wanted to be a better participant in that process, what could they work on?
Being more invested in inquiring into their own sense of self. To make that investigation more interesting than any other activity. In fact, as soon as we find ourselves in true self-inquiry, and I sort of was picking on the question of why, there's nothing wrong with the why, but the encouragement is to go deeper beyond the why. But as soon as we find ourselves invested in that inquiry process, and we get deeper and deeper glimpses into the self that is not separate, that is formless, that is beyond the nama rupa, it becomes, if we're open to it, excuse me, the only game in town. It becomes such an investment. Everything else pales in comparison. Am I eating the proper food today? Pales in comparison to that investigation. Yet, as a nutritionist, there's a funny part of me that says, but yes, do pay attention to what you're eating when it's time to eat or prepare food. But when you're done preparing and eating food, don't put your mind on eating and preparing food. If you're brushing your teeth, be with the experience of brushing teeth. If you're engaged in a beautiful dialogue, be fully invested in that. And if you can make the present experience more interesting, and you can cultivate a sense of being invested in what is, the rest simply falls away. The so-called difficulty becomes a historical footnote. But it doesn't mean that the complexity and the difficulty will never arise again. It might. But the more I have cultivated a sense of inquiring into myself, those old conditioned thoughts of separation and difficulty and challenge simply won't linger. It'll be a thought and it'll dissipate, but you want to attach or identify with it. In the same sense of using the analogy of the ship at sea, you can cut the engines, but it's not going to come to a full stop. There's a momentum. And even after this so-called enlightenment experience, if we can use that language, it doesn't mean that that's a complete and utter end of all conditioned thoughts, feelings, and emotions. Because they will have their own momentum. If we can invest in if we can make our greater investments, I would love to know where that came from. I'm no longer identified with the thought because I'm curious about where it came from. I would love to know the one who feels insufficient. And then there's the realization again, it's not me. I'm not insufficient. Therefore, the thought just passes on. And the more I cultivate that, the less and less I have that quality of thinking. Because now it's been replaced with a more loving quality of thinking and perceiving and sensing.
We spoke a little bit about context when we were discussing sort of the written age and the digital age. But by far the longest period of human culture was the prehistoric period. And I'm curious what you feel might be the relevance of shamanic contexts to the kind of work that you're doing and to the what might shamanism have still to offer in terms of the non-dual becoming more conscious as human experience?
I don't know a lot about shamanism. I did undergo a shamanic journey with a friend. Her name is Heather, in San Francisco. And it was a profound experience where I think for the first time, I sensed that I was that which is prior to the body and mind. Does shamanic practices have a place? I feel that it does. I feel that any practice, shamanic, mystical Christian practices, whatever they are, um, metaphysical practices, things that might be encouraged in um, A Course in Miracles, for example, uh, have relevance still. They don't really they don't conflict with non-dual teachings at all, I don't feel. The only conflict is when any practice, method, teaching, even non-dual teachings, becomes serious. Then, then we get a problem. Then we have conflict. So I see the benefit and the beauty in abstinence as much as I see the beauty and relevance and the value in an emotion of fear that might arise, because it has very practical uh, implications. As fear might arise, it might be that one spark to then have me go within and inquire. But of course, if we're in chronic fear, well, then we just have inflammation. But it doesn't mean that even in a state of chronic fear, that there won't be this moment, this spark of insight that would arise to redirect my attention inward. And so I see value in all of it. In fact, I went to, by invitation of a friend, to a kiva. It was a sweat in a kiva, clothing optional sweat, in just outside of Albuquerque. And I told my friend, who is Indigenous American, who was part of this sweat, I said, I find it interesting that I'm participating in this. And she inquired into why I found it interesting. I said, because it's not necessary, and yet I feel the freedom to engage. And you could see this sort of moment of confusion that arises in her. And then it immediately gave way to recognition. And so then I imbibed, I participated in the sweat without the need that it's going to give me something or do something for me. And so there was a freedom to be fully immersed in the experience and listening to the chants and smelling the sage. And it was a deeply immersive, profoundly immersive experience. So I found it, on the surface, I'll call it delightful, but it was so impactful for me. It was so beautiful in ways that I can't articulate, but it was not necessary, utterly unnecessary.
One of the things we associate with indigenous culture is the notion of thinking of ourselves multi-generationally, and without getting uh, trapped in future and past, nonetheless, framing our articulation as if we were trying to be good ancestors of generations to come. And I wonder if you imagine yourself as the as the grandmother of future generations of non-dual realizers, what your message would be. What would you want to say to people doing this work in 2070 or in the 22nd century? Would you want to tell them?
That the message would be the same from generation to generation. Know thyself. To be so invested in the knowing of myself, irregardless of what your great-great-grandmother Leeza said. To be so fully in love with life. And if I feel that I cannot love, then of course the message is, can you be open to loving? And if that's a stretch, can you prepare yourself to be opening? Are you open to even cultivating a sense of knowing thyself? And so I think the message would always be the same as asking myself, what am I cultivating? Who is the one that is doing the cultivating? And is there really a distance between myself and myself? Or the I and the one that knows I? And in the realization that there is no distance, there is no path to traverse, I'm free to take on the journey. I'm free to see it playfully as a path to see my ancestor yet again, to be one with the ancestor, knowing that if I see it as being reunified with my ancestor, that the deeper message is that I'm coming to know myself again, because my ancestor and I are not separate either. So it becomes the lineage, the student and the teacher. It becomes the unified student-teacher, then ultimately becomes to, I am the student and I am the teacher. I've always been the student and the teacher, and I will always be the student and the teacher. Because I know that there is no true sense of separation outside of the five senses. I feel that that would be the message. And the persistent refrain